You are carrying money that is worth something only because everybody agrees it is. No metal behind it, no promise you could go and collect. I want to show you the first time in history anyone pulled that off. It happened in Sichuan, in Western China, and by 1023, the Chinese state was printing it, 400 years before Europe printed a banknote of its own. And it did not begin with an emperor, or a treasury, or a grand theory of money. It began with a group of merchants who were simply tired of carrying iron. Within 1 century, the same invention was paying for wars. Within 3, it had destroyed the value of everything it touched. In the next half hour, I will show you how paper money was actually built, the 3 rules that made it work, and the exact point where every single version of it broke. Because the mistake was never printing paper. The mistake was always the same one. It is always made for a good reason, and governments are still making it today. Start with the problem, because the problem is the entire reason paper money exists, and it is a physical problem rather than a financial one. In the early years of the Northern Song, most of China ran on copper coins. Sichuan did not. Partly geography, partly policy. Copper was scarce and strategically controlled, and mountains walled the region off from the rest of the empire. Iron works perfectly well as a metal. It works very badly as money, and for one reason that has nothing to do with economics and everything to do with physics. It is heavy and it is cheap, which means that the amount of it you need in order to buy anything real weighs an absurd amount. The figure usually quoted is that 1,000 large iron coins weighed about 25 catties. Call it 15 kilos, give or take. And a single bolt of silk, an ordinary trade good, costs somewhere between 90 and over 100 catties of iron coin, which is, very approximately, 50 kilograms of money. For 1 bolt of cloth. I want you to hold the weight of that rather than the number. Picture the transaction, not the price, the logistics. You do not put 50 kilos into a purse. So the cost of using money was itself a cost. Every trade carried a transport bill and a security bill stacked on top of the actual price of the goods. For buying a meal, fine. For a merchant moving goods between towns, the money weighed more than the goods did, and that is not a market. This is the situation people mean when they say that necessity drives invention, except that necessity usually just produces complaining. What made Sichuan different is that it had a second ingredient sitting right next to the problem. It had wealthy, long-established merchant houses that everybody in the region already trusted. Trust is the raw material here. Not paper, not ink, not printing technology. Everything that follows is built out of somebody's willingness to believe a promise made by somebody else. And the promise being made at the start was very small and very specific, and that is exactly why it worked when much grander versions later failed. It was not that this paper is money. Nobody in 11th century Chengdu would have accepted that. It was that this paper is a receipt. You hand a merchant house your iron coins. They write down how much you handed over. They give you a slip of paper that says so, with their mark on it. Later, you, or anyone else holding that slip, walk in, hand it over, and take the coins back out. A cloakroom ticket. That is all a banknote has ever been. It is why an English banknote still carries the words, "I promise to pay the bearer," which is a sentence about a coat. Everything else in the 1,000-year story of paper money is what happens when somebody notices what a cloakroom ticket can be persuaded to do. In Chengdu, this stopped being an occasional favor between merchants and became an actual business with premises, staff, and a product. By the traditional account, 16 of the wealthiest merchant households set up jiaozi shops, dedicated offices that printed the notes, issued them, and handled the exchange back into iron coin on demand. Jiaozi. The word is usually rendered as something like an exchange medium, and it is the first thing in the record a modern person would call a banknote. Now notice what those 16 houses had built between them, apparently without anyone sitting down and planning it. They had built a clearing system, because if a note issued by house number 4 is accepted in the shop of house number 9, then those notes are no longer receipts from one merchant. They are money. And that is the leap. Not the paper, the mutual acceptance. The moment a note is good somewhere other than where it was issued, it has stopped being a private claim and started being a currency. They printed them properly too. Seals, distinctive inks, complicated designs, marks that were difficult and expensive to reproduce convincingly. That was not decoration. That was anti-counterfeiting. 1,000 years ago, solving the problem a modern mint solves with holograms. For a while, this ran well. Merchants could move value between towns without a caravan of metal behind them, and the cost of trading across the region fell sharply. And then it did what private money has done in every century and every country in which it has ever been tried. Some of the issuers went bad. Some houses issued more notes than they held coin to honor. Some spent the deposits on their own ventures. People arrived to redeem notes, and there was nothing behind the counter. Lawsuits followed. Confidence, which had taken years to build up, disappeared in a matter of weeks. And I want to be careful here because there is a lazy version of this story in which greedy merchants ruin a good thing and the wise state saves it. That is not quite what happened. The merchants had proved the instrument worked at their own expense. What they could not supply was the one thing the instrument needed most. Not honesty, standardization. 16 issuers meant 16 different qualities of promise, and no way at all for an ordinary person to tell one from another at the moment of accepting it. A currency cannot be a judgment call. The entire point of money is that you accept it without doing any research from someone you will never see again. So the state had a genuine problem in front of it, and, unusually for a government in any century, it went on to solve that problem rather well. Not immediately, though, and not gently. The first official response was the obvious one: shut private issue down and prosecute the failures. But shutting it down left the original problem exactly where it had been. The iron was still heavy. The trade still needed doing. The mountains had not moved. Which sets up the moment that this episode is actually about, and it is a moment of institutional imagination rather than technology. Because somebody inside the government looked at a failed private experiment and did not conclude that the idea itself had been a bad one. They concluded that the idea had simply needed a better issuer and that they were looking at one. The prefect of Yizhou, the prefecture that Chengdu sits in, was a man named Shui Tian, and he put forward a proposal that is one of the most consequential documents you have never heard of. Do not ban the notes. Take them over. Let the state issue them from one office to one standard, redeemable in coin by anyone holding one. The proposal was accepted. In 1023, the government established a Jiaozi office in Yizhou to do exactly that. You will also see the date given as the 12th of January, 1024, and both are right. Either way, that is the moment. Paper money became legal tender, issued by a state, held against a reserve for the first time anywhere on earth. Not a receipt, not a merchant's favor, not an experiment, money by law, made of paper. 400 years before Europe printed its first banknote. That is roughly the distance from Columbus sailing to the invention of the aeroplane. And I want to slow right down on what that office actually did, because this is the part that gets skipped, and it is the part that carries the lesson. Anybody can print paper. Printing paper is not an achievement. The Jiaozi office is interesting because of the rules it agreed to print that paper under. First, the notes were convertible. You could walk into the office and exchange them for iron coin. Second, the office held a reserve of coin against the notes it had issued. Not enough to cover every note simultaneously. No bank in history has ever done that. But a real maintained reserve. And I am not going to give you a percentage, because you will find one online and there is no source I am willing to stand behind for it. A reserve existed. How large it was is not something I can prove to you. Third, and this is the genuinely clever one, the one I think about most, the notes had a term. They were issued in 3-year cycles. Each issue circulated for 3 years. Then it was called back in and exchanged for the next issue, and the old paper stopped being money. Which sounds like bureaucratic fussiness, an administrative habit, and is in fact one of the best pieces of monetary engineering anyone has ever come up with. Because if every note has to come home every 3 years, then the state finds out, on a fixed schedule it cannot avoid, exactly how much paper is really out there in the world. It caps the useful life of a counterfeit. It forces a public reckoning, and it makes quiet, overissue very hard to conceal because the arithmetic arrives every 3rd year whether the Treasury wants it or not. A modern central banker would recognize that instinct instantly. It is an accountability mechanism built directly into the money rather than into the character of the people issuing it. So, convertible, reserved, and term limited. 3 constraints, all of them pointing in the same direction, all of them aimed at the same single danger. All 3 exist to stop the issuer doing the one thing that an issuer of paper money can always, at any moment, simply choose to do. Print more. Hold on to that, because everything that follows, 400 years of it, across 3 dynasties, is people finding their way around those 3 rules, one at a time, always for an excellent reason. For a good while, though, it simply worked, and it is worth sitting with how strange that actually is. A government voluntarily accepted binding limits on its own ability to create money out of nothing, and then kept to those limits for decades without being forced to. The instrument spread and matured. It was reissued, refined, and eventually renamed. Later, Northern song notes circulate under the name Qian Yin rather than Jiaozi. Different name, same machine underneath. Paper, issued in fixed terms, redeemable in coin, held against a reserve. And the economy sitting on top of it did what economies always do when transaction costs collapse. It got bigger, faster, and more specialized. This is the underrated half of the story. Paper money is not merely a convenience. It is a change in what is physically possible. When value can travel inside a sleeve instead of on the back of a mule, the distance a merchant can profitably trade increases permanently. Markets that were effectively separate become one market. Prices that had nothing to do with each other start to move together because goods can now flow between them. The Song economy in this period is, by many measures, the most commercially advanced on the planet. Enormous cities, deep markets, industrial-scale production. Paper money is not the sole cause of that, and I would not claim it was. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question, and it is the question sitting underneath this entire episode. If the system was this good and the rules this sensible, why is there not a Song banknote in your pocket right now? Why does every single account of Chinese paper money, without exception, end in disaster? The answer is not that the design was flawed. I want to be clear about that because it is usually told as a cautionary tale about paper itself. The answer is that the design quietly assumed one thing that no design can ever assume about the institution operating it. It assumed the issuer would rather keep its own rules than solve an emergency. And a state, sooner or later, always has an emergency that is very close to the definition of a state. Usually a war, occasionally a famine or a flood, but usually a war. So here is the trap, stated as plainly as I can manage. Convertibility, reserves, and fixed terms are constraints that bind an issuer who does not urgently need money. They are precisely the constraints that an issuer discards the moment it does. The rules are strongest exactly when they are least needed, and weakest exactly when they matter. In 1127, the Northern Song lost its northern territory to invasion, and the court fled south to rebuild what it could. What survived is what historians call the Southern Song. Geographically smaller, remarkably wealthy per head, and permanently either at war or paying somebody not to start one. That state issued its own paper money called huizi, and huizi is where you can actually watch the machine begin to slip in slow motion over decades. The design was still there on paper. Huizi were issued every 2 to 3 years, and they carried in expiry old notes exchanged for new ones, exactly as the Jiaozi office had done. So, on paper, the discipline was intact. The reckoning still happened. The forms were all observed correctly. But a rule is only a rule if breaking it costs more than keeping it, and for a state financing a permanent military frontier, that arithmetic changes completely. taxes are slow, unpopular, and physically difficult to collect from a peasantry. Borrowing is limited by who will lend. Printing is instant, silent, and requires nobody's consent. So the Southern Song printed. And then, when the notes fell in value, they printed more in order to cover the shortfall that the falling value had itself caused. That second sentence is the whole disease, and it is worth separating out. Not the first printing, the printing done to fix the consequences of the printing, because at that point, the quantity of money is being set by the government's cash needs rather than by the economy's demand for money. And those two numbers have no reason to be the same. The expiry mechanism, which had been the safety valve, now becomes something else entirely. If each new issue is larger than the one it replaces, the 3-year reckoning stops being a check and becomes a ratchet. And convertibility goes first. It always goes first. In every country, in every century, without a single exception I am aware of. A state under fiscal pressure cannot allow people to swap paper for metal because if they all try it at once, there is not enough metal, and crucially, everybody knows there is not enough metal. So redemption is restricted, then suspended temporarily, then quietly forgotten about. And at that precise moment, the note has stopped being a claim on anything at all. It has become a piece of paper whose value rests entirely on the state's word, which is exactly what the money in your pocket is, with one enormous difference. A modern central bank has a published inflation target, independent statistics, and an institutional reason to keep the currency stable that outlives whoever is in charge. The Southern Song Treasury had a war to pay for this month, and a chancellor who would be judged on whether it was paid for. Huizi lost value. Not catastrophically at first, but persistently, in the way that teaches an entire population to spend paper quickly and hold silver instead. And once a population has learned that particular lesson, you cannot unteach it with a decree, though an impressive number of rulers across history have tried, usually with penalties attached. That is where the Song part of the story ends. Not in a single dramatic collapse, but in a long, grinding erosion of the one thing the Jiaozi office had really invented. Not paper, credibility. Paper was the easy part. And then the Mongols arrived and the experiment suddenly got very much bigger. Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty took the Chinese paper money system, looked at it, and did something no Song emperor had ever dared to do. It made paper the only legal money in the empire. Not the convenient option for merchants, not an instrument for large transactions. The sole legal tender across the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Historians of the period treat this as a genuine first, the first regime anywhere to run its entire monetary system on paper, by design and by law. And here is the detail that surprises almost everybody, because it cuts directly against the story people expect from a conquest dynasty. The yuan did not begin by debasing anything. The yuan began by putting paper onto a precious metal standard. The ka was issued against silver. Modern research describes it as the first paper money in history backed by a precious metal. Read that twice, because it inverts the usual morality tale. The Mongol conquerors ran a tighter and more principled monetary standard than the sophisticated dynasty they had replaced. They were not naive about enforcement. The system was administered, audited, and enforced extremely hard. Refusing to accept the notes was not a market decision that a shopkeeper got to make. It was a crime, with the penalties you would expect. And it worked well enough that a foreign visitor found the whole thing genuinely astonishing and wrote it down. Marco Polo's account of China contains a description of the issue of paper money that reads exactly like a man trying to explain a magic trick he has just watched. Bark from mulberry trees, cut into sheets, stamped with the Khan seal, and accepted everywhere in the empire for anything at all, on pain of death. To a European of the 13th century, whose money was metal because money simply was metal, this was close to alchemy, value conjured out of a tree by an official with a stamp. It was not alchemy, it was administration, backed by a state that could enforce its word. Which is more impressive than alchemy and considerably more fragile. Because a metal standard only holds for exactly as long as the issuer remains willing to be held to it, and willingness is not a property of a system. And over roughly a century, the yuan issued 5 entirely distinct paper currencies, one after another, the Zhongtong notes from 1260, then the first ziyuan issue, then zida, then a second ziyuan, then zizheng, running to the dynasty's final years. 5 currencies in 108 years. Nobody replaces their money 5 times in a century because things are going well. Each replacement is a reset, a formal admission that the previous issue had lost so much value that continuing to use it was no longer practical. And the cause, every single time, was the one the song had already discovered: fiscal pressure. The scholarship on yuan money is blunt about the mechanism. Military and fiscal demands generated overissue, and overissue generated inflation. Badly early, catastrophically at the end. The silver standard was eased, then quietly abandoned. Paper stopped being a claim on metal and became purely fiat, value by decree alone, backed by nothing but the state saying so. And a decree is worth exactly as much as the state issuing it, which is a perfectly workable arrangement right up until the moment that state begins to lose. By the middle of the 14th century, the yuan was fighting rebellions across the country that it could not possibly afford to fight. The Zizheng issue, the last one, arrives in 1352 into a state that is already coming apart at the seams, and it does what last issues always do. It funded the war by destroying the money. Oh! By 1368, when the Ming took the empire, paper money was close to worthless across China. And here is the sentence that should genuinely stop you, because it is the real cost of getting this particular thing wrong. Towns and cities were reverting to barter, not to silver, not to copper coin, to trading goods directly for other goods, in the most commercially sophisticated society on earth 4 centuries after it invented the banknote. That is what a currency collapse actually is. Not a price index moving on a chart, an entire economy losing the ability to use money at all and falling back on a technology that predates writing. Every transaction now requires a coincidence of wants. Every trade needs both parties to want what the other one has at the same moment, in the same place. The Song had spent 300 years building an economy that did not need that coincidence. It came apart inside a single generation. And the Ming, having watched all of that happen, tried again anyway. They issued the Great Ming Treasure Note, and they made one decision at the outset that doomed it before the first sheet was printed. It was inconvertible. There was no promise to exchange it for anything, no metal behind it, no redemption window, no term, no reckoning. Every single constraint the Jiaozi office had invented in 1023 was simply left out of the design. It depreciated. Of course it did. A note that is a claim on nothing, issued by a treasury that needs money, has exactly one direction available to it. I am not going to give you a year for when the Ming finally gave up on it, because I could not verify one, and a confident wrong date is worse than an honest gap in a story. What I can tell you is where China's money actually ended up, not paper. Silver by weight. Weighed on a scale, tested for purity, cut into pieces for ordinary everyday commerce. The country that invented the banknote spent the following centuries weighing metal. It had not forgotten how to make paper money. It had learned what happens when the issuer cannot be trusted, and that lesson is very much harder to unlearn than it is to teach. So let me put the whole arc into one shape, because the shape is the lesson and the details are just the evidence. Merchants invent a receipt in order to solve a weight problem. The receipt becomes money because those merchants start accepting each other's. Private issue fails, not out of wickedness, but from having no common standard that an ordinary person can check. The state takes it over and does something genuinely wise. It builds 3 constraints directly into the money. You can redeem it, we hold a reserve against it, and every note comes home every 3 years. It works. For decades, it works beautifully, and the economy it makes possible is the most advanced anywhere in the world. Then war. and the constraints, one at a time, in a predictable order, become inconvenient. Redemption is suspended because it has to be. The reserve is spent because it is sitting there. The term becomes a ratchet because each issue is larger than the last one. And nothing about the paper itself changes. The notes look identical. The seals are the same seals. Only the promise behind them has gone, and the promise was the only part that was ever worth anything. Now I want to be fair to these governments because it is easy to be smug from here. Not one of them printed money because they were stupid or did not understand the consequences. Each one printed because the alternative that week was losing a war or failing to feed an army in the field. Inflation is a cost you pay later, spread thinly across everybody, most of whom will not be able to name what happened to them. A lost war is a cost you pay now, and personally and visibly. Any government in any century will take the later cost. Which is why the interesting question is never whether the issuer will be disciplined. The answer to that is no, eventually. The question is, what stops the issuer when discipline fails? The Jiaozi office had an answer, and the answer was mechanical. The 3-year reckoning did not depend on anybody's good intentions or on who happened to be prefect that year. Every modern arrangement you can name is an attempt at the same thing: central bank independence, inflation targets, published statistics, debt ceilings, currency boards. All of them are versions of one single idea: put something between the person who urgently needs money and the machine that makes it. And all of them share the weakness the Song system had, which is that a constraint is only ever as strong as the willingness to keep it when keeping it hurts. A rule that can be suspended in an emergency will be because emergencies are the reason anybody suspends rules. The Song learned that. The Yuan learned it 5 separate times. The Ming skipped the rules altogether and learned it fastest of all. 1,000 years later, the machine is the same machine. The paper is now an entry in a database, which changes the physics completely, and the incentives not at all. And you are the one holding the notes. So let me hand you the part of this that you can actually use. 4 things drawn from 1,000 years of evidence rather than from theory. 1. Money is a promise, and the value of a promise is the credibility of whoever made it. When you evaluate a currency, you are evaluating an issuer. Every currency crisis in history, Song, Yuan, Weimar, or one from last year, is the same underlying event: a market repricing and issuer's credibility. 2. Watch what happens to convertibility in whatever form it takes in your era. When an issuer restricts your ability to get out, capital controls, redemption suspended, withdrawal limits, a window that is closed today, that is not a technicality. It is the oldest warning signal there is, and in this story, it is the very first thing to go, every single time, in every dynasty, without exception. 3. Look for the mechanical constraint, not the stated intention. The Jiaozi office's 3-year cycle worked precisely because it did not require anybody involved to be virtuous. So ask of any institution holding your money, what forces the reckoning, and can whoever runs it simply switch that off? An intention can be revised quietly on a Tuesday. A mechanism has to be dismantled, and dismantling is something other people can see. 4. A currency collapse does not look like a crash. It looks like a slow, private relearning, in which people start pricing in something else, quoting in something else, and holding something else. In Sichuan, they went back to silver. In the late Yuan, they went back to barter. Nobody announced either transition. The behavior changed first, and the official story caught up years afterwards. So when you read that people in some country have started quoting prices in dollars, that is not local color in a news report. That is the measurement. And one last thought, which is not a takeaway, but is the actual reason I wanted to make this episode. The Jiaozi office is 1,000 years old, and it understood something that a great deal of modern commentary still does not. It did not try to create an honest money. It tried to create a money that did not require the issuer to be honest. That is a much deeper idea, and every serious monetary design since, gold standards, currency boards, independent central banks, the digital ones people argue about now, is a variation on it. We have been having the same argument for 1,000 years. And the people who started it were merchants in Chengdu who did not want to carry 50 kilograms of iron. If that was worth half an hour of your time, following the channel is the thing that genuinely helps. It is the signal that tells the algorithm to show this to somebody else. And I would like to know what you make of the 3-year rule, because I have come to think it is the single most underrated invention in this entire story. The comments are the right place, and I do read them. Next Monday, the story of money reaches the moment when the entire world agreed to tie its money to one single metal, and then, in 1971, quietly untied it. Episode 5 is the gold standard, why it was built, what it actually promised the person holding the note, and what precisely changed on the day that promise was withdrawn. If this episode was about an issuer discovering that it could break its own rules, that one is about the last time the whole world agreed to a rule at all. Sichuan 1023, a reserve, a redemption window, and a reckoning every 3 years. Everything since has been a footnote to those 3 ideas. I am Maja. That was the story of money. Have a look at what is in your pocket and ask yourself who is promising what and what would happen if you tried to collect.